It is my great pleasure to introduce the Honourable Catherine King, Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government. Minister King is going to deliver a keynote address, and then she will be joined on stage by CEDA's Chairman Diane Smith-Gander for what I'm sure will be a lively Q&A. Please join me in welcoming the Minister.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Melinda, and can I too begin by acknowledging the Gadigal peoples of the Aurora Nation, the lands on which we gather today, and I pay my respects to Elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any First Nations people who are here today. Infrastructure and industry built across our vast land has a unique responsibility to respect and consider the experiences, cultures and histories of our First Nations communities who've cared for these lands for time immemorial. And as we consider the theme of this conference, building on the past, shaping the future, that is something we absolutely should keep in mind. Thank you to the CEDA team once again for having me here today. I've been taking part in these events for quite some time now, and I always appreciate the opportunity that you provide me to address such an engaged and knowledgeable audience. Today, the Commonwealth is investing more money in infrastructure across Australia than any point in our history, with the 10-year pipeline is now sitting over $120 billion. We are jointly funding more than 440 major projects across the nation, including over 100 here in New South Wales. We've established new project corridors. Many of these are in regional Australia. With that investment, we are delivering nation-shaping projects which support a range of economic and social objectives, including regional connectivity, livability and safety, including our current commitment to major projects across this state, such as the $10.4 billion Sydney Metro to Western Sydney Airport and the $2.1 billion M1 Pacific Motorway extension to Raymond Terrace. Just this week, Bitchery released its most recent quarterly infrastructure construction figures, closing out the 2023 calendar year. These figures show that public social sector expenditure on road construction was at $18.8 billion for the 12 months of December 2023, and public expenditure on rail was $13.4 billion. This was around an 18% increase and a 17.6% increase on the previous calendar years, respectively. And for both of those figures, that was the highest level of spending on record. And when you look at that on a state basis, New South Wales saw the highest level of road spending growth. Our investment here in this state includes our $1.63 billion investment in the new M12 motorway between the M7 and Northern Road, and our $2.2 billion investment in the new 14-kilometre Coffs Harbour bypass on the Pacific Highway. Just as it says in the theme of today's event, and just like we did when we were last in government, when the Prime Minister was and held this portfolio, we are building on the past and we are shaping the future. We're able to make investments in infrastructure because the government has undertaken what has been hard work to reform how the Commonwealth invests in infrastructure across the country. When I spoke to you in March last year, the government was in the midst of a major reform. We were then busy implementing meaningful changes to strengthen Infrastructure Australia's ability to provide the government with quality, independent advice. Those reforms passed the Parliament in early December last year, defining IA's mandate, improving the evaluation of infrastructure proposals, refining the products Infrastructure Australia delivers to better support government investment objectives, and including ensuring a more targeted infrastructure priority list. These changes were designed to restore Infrastructure Australia's crucial role and primary role as the Commonwealth Government's independent infrastructure advisor. Right now, as we are going through our 2024 budget process, Infrastructure Australia is again playing an important role, and I acknowledge Gabrielle, who's here with us today, and thank the board and staff of IA for the work that they've been doing for me. Soon after that conference, I also released Dr Kerry Schott's report into the governance and delivery of Inland Rail. That report was a pretty damning indictment about a major infrastructure project even though that frankly hasn't stopped one of the people most responsible for those mistakes being able to spruik his work on the national broadsheet over recent weeks. As we'd say in my home state, more front than Myers. While the report found that the project remained important, it found that even though the Liberals and Nationals had delivered just 16% of the project, they had managed to blow out the costs to around about $31 billion, but we didn't even have confidence in that figure. This was double the price that the Coalition said it would cost as recently back as 2020. Dr Schott concluded that, somewhat surprisingly, the project had commenced delivery without knowing where it would start or finish, adding that the final date and cost remained uncertain because of a lack of confidence in the latest cost estimates. The mismanagement of this project was flagrant, which is why our government had accepted all 19 recommendations of the report, beginning the very, very hard work, and pardon the pun, of getting this project back on track. This is important work that we're continuing to undertake, and what that has meant is that we are prioritising completing the works from Melbourne to Parkes, and north of that, working hard to again required environmental and planning approvals, secure land needed to protect that corridor. Next on our reform agenda was the independent strategic review of the infrastructure investment pipeline, a landmark step to ensuring that the Commonwealth's land transport infrastructure pipeline investment is sustainable, fit for purpose and actually able to be delivered. The independent review found that the pipeline of land transport infrastructure projects that we inherited from our predecessors was congested and simply unaffordable. Further, the mix of large and small-scale projects clogging the pipeline had led to unprecedented and unsustainable pressures on construction materials and on skilled labour. Informed by the recommendations of the review and following consultation with state and territory governments, in November we made some difficult but very necessary changes to the infrastructure pipeline that we inherited. This includes reshaping how the Commonwealth funds projects going forward, returning to a preference of 50-50 funding with states and territories for future investments, so that both levels of government carry an equal share of both the benefits and the risks, particularly when it comes to properly scoping projects to minimise unexpected cost escalations. As I said, these were hard decisions, but ones that were absolutely necessary to put the pipeline on a sustainable footing and to take pressure off inflation. It was these hard decisions that allowed us to contribute the extra $6.8 billion to help cover cost pressures on major works in MyEFO that we've announced for Western Australia, South Australia, an additional $2 billion there, Queensland, an additional $2 billion there, Northern Territory, Tasmania and the ACT. And I will have more to say prior to the budget about the projects that require additional funding for cost pressures in New South Wales and Victoria as part of that process. It was these hard decisions that mean the Commonwealth can continue to invest in the right infrastructure projects that support Australia's growing cities and regions, underpinned by strong supporting evidence and demonstrated value for money. It was also these hard decisions that meant in November last year I could announce Roads to Recovery funding will increase progressively from $500 million as it sits today to $1 billion per year, giving every single local government, over 500 of them in Australia, more money to spend upgrading local roads. It also meant that I could announce more funding for black spot funding, those road safety projects, increasing that from $110 million to $150 per year, making our road network on those local community roads safer and more reliable. At the same time, I also announced we would further improve safety, particularly through our freight vehicles, by merging the Heavy Vehicle Safety and Productivity Program, Bridges Renewal Program into a new Safer Local Roads and Infrastructure Program, with the funding allocated to those programs to increase over the term as well. Importantly, the reform work we undertook over the last year means that I will be able to have more to say in coming weeks about new projects we'll be committing to as part of this year's budget. To ensure that these new projects we announced don't repeat the mistakes of the previous government, in November last year I also released the Australian Government's Infrastructure Policy Statement to guide the way we invest in transport infrastructure, aiming to unlock a range of significant economic, social and environmental objectives. The policy statement commits the government to focusing on delivering nationally significant infrastructure projects Nationally significant means those projects which have a clear role for the Commonwealth, the unique position that the Commonwealth holds, and which deliver on three priorities for our investments: productivity and resilience, livability and sustainability. It means more efficient roads, ensuring supply chains are resilient, building equity into the heart of where we live, improving prosperity, reducing our emissions and encouraging more sustainable ways to travel. I can't give away too much yet. I know you would like me to, but we will be announcing some of those new projects in the budget, but I can assure you that those investments are being guided by the principles in the statement. As I said at the start, our government is investing more money in infrastructure than any other in our history, and we are doing that in a way that is more responsible, more transparent and more effective than our predecessors. Under the last Labor government, my predecessor in this job, the now Prime Minister of our country, worked hard to invest sustainably in the projects that mattered most to Australians. Proudly, we invested in transformational projects like the Moorebank Intermodal Terminal we just opened a week or so ago. We started planning for Western Sydney Airport. We completed the duplication of the Hume Highway between Sydney and Melbourne, and we rebuilt a third of the interstate rail network. We did this listening to the best advice of the experts at Infrastructure Australia, and we did it based on the needs of the nation. Since coming to government, we have undertaken the difficult task of returning us to those days and putting Australia's infrastructure spend on a more sustainable footing. We've built on the work of those reforming Labor governments and ministers who came before us, who invested on sound expert advice and not on political greed. We've reformed how the Commonwealth engages with our partners in the states, territories and local government. And we're investing in projects that will shape our nation's future through making it more sustainable, more resilient and more prosperous for communities across the country. And I thank all of you in this room very much for joining us in that work. Thank you for having me here this morning.
As usual, clear communication and an interesting address. Now, this is an opportunity to actually ask questions to a minister who will answer them, something that you don't get every day of the week. So I'm just pointing you to the Pigeonhole app, where you can put your questions into the app. I'll see them here and be able to pose them to the minister. So on the table you've got a QR code as well, which enables you to be able to quickly access the app. So those of you in the room that haven't managed to find that yet, that's how to do it. And for our online audience, you have access to Pigeonhole, ceda.pigeonhole.at, and the password is infrastructure. I have it in all caps. I suspect it is case sensitive.
And I've just seen my niece in the audience, so I'm telling her you're not to ask a question, Erin.
I think you must indeed. I'll be looking closely for
She'll be in trouble at Christmas if she does. Sorry.
But please put the family reference in there. So, Minister, this is becoming a bit of our annual catch-up.
Yes.
Really, and normally we do have an announcement. So I think we're allowed to be a little bit disappointed that there wasn't an announcement this time. But I think where I would like to start is if you could tell us, given all of the change that you have made, in the last few years, and now through 3 budgets and a 4th one soon to come, you have gone and looked at the priorities. You've had to go through the list again and check it twice and work out what is going to be on that list. And you've changed refocused the role of Infrastructure Australia, I think is probably a good way to put it. But for your mind, where's the biggest opportunity if we get infrastructure right? Where's the thing that you're really focused on?
Well, the first thing I'd do would point you to the Prime Minister's announcement yesterday about a future made in Australia. We are very, very serious about seizing the opportunity that we have in this country from the unique assets we have, both to ensure that we make that transition to the energy transition but we also bear in mind the national security of this country. What is it that we need to do? And at the heart of that for me in infrastructure is productivity. How are we actually ensuring that we are investing in productivity building infrastructure? How are we making sure that our infrastructure investment actually also meets our needs in relation to decarbonisation? How are we ensuring the way in which freight moves around the country and people move around the country is being done in the way that is adding to productivity, is ensuring that we keep those principles around road safety, making sure we decarbonise at the same time. So I think infrastructure is absolutely central to the productivity agenda of the nation. It's why Inland Rail is an incredibly important project. Once we get that project to Parks, that does then you start to see the vision of it, being able to connect over to the west, being able to see Parks as a central hub of rail freight, being able to actually engage the way in which we use our intermodal terminals, Beveridge, Ebenezer, Parks, as well as Moorebank, really as part of that freight task. So I think there is a huge opportunity for infrastructure, but also many challenges along the way with that.
Inland Rail, it always gets a lot of attention, and rightly so.
Big project.
Last year we talked about the fact that it wasn't planned on linking up to ports. You said in your address, didn't know where it was going to start and didn't know where it was going to finish when you inherited it. So can you talk a little bit about where it will start, do you think, where it will finish, will it go to ports? And we have a question from our audience. The changes that have been made meant that people who thought they had a contract no longer had a contract. And so there are lots of people in the infrastructure ecosystem who've ended up with pretty big holes in their revenue budgets. How do you think about how you ameliorate that as well?
Sure. Well, in terms of Inland Rail, so obviously we've purchased, National Intermodal Corporation has purchased the land at Beveridge, and we're about to build basically a bigger Moorebank at Beveridge. It's a huge project for the state of Victoria. It will mean 7,000 jobs. Moorebank in itself, when we opened it, is already generating, it's got 100 megawatts of solar, and it's an incredible project. Beveridge will have 200. So it's a really significant investment. The SHOT report also says we'll need the two, so the West WIFT will also be needed, and we're doing the work now with the Victorian State Government about what that looks like and how we preserve that into the future. We're also looking obviously at acquiring land at Ebenezer and making sure that that terminal is fit for purpose, and we've just started the work of that as well. We're determined to build Inland Rail. The issue really that we inherited is that I don't think there is any board in the country that would make an investment decision when you don't know the route, when you don't know the cost, when you don't know whether you're going to get environmental planning approvals, and you haven't got the right governance structures or the structures to deliver a project. And that's really what we've inherited. It's why we've now separated the Australian Rail Track Corporation, going back to its core business of running and maintaining the rail freight network, the new Inland Rail Proprietary Limited, new company that is the delivery company for Inland Rail, new CEOs, new boards, new governance structures put in place, new financing structures being put in place, and concentrating on getting a return for investment as soon as we can by getting it to Parks and doing the planning work to make sure we've also got, as the Inland Rail Review asked us to do, the cost assurance work to really get a very good handle of just how much this project's going to cost going forward. I don't think, as I said, any boardroom around the table would make an investment with the level of unknowns we've got with Inland Rail, but we are absolutely doing the work to ensure that happens. Understands for those who had that planned for projections, obviously where we've entered into contracts, we've honoured the break clauses of those, and we'll continue to do that through any projects that we've done. But really, this is, as I said, it would have been completely irresponsible of me just to continue with business as usual on that project. It was very clear there were some significant problems and that there weren't any brakes being put on, and I think that would have been irresponsible of me as an infrastructure minister to come in and ignore those.
I think part of the issue with the state of the project, as you decided, was clearly coordination between different levels of government and getting agreement as to how that project should press forward. And so we've got a question from the audience around this coordination with the state, politely saying it has many opportunities, but it's very challenging. I think that's an incredibly polite way of putting it. And you've talked about Infrastructure Australia and the role that it needs to take. So the audience is interested to know, what's the role of Infrastructure Australia going to be in ensuring that joined up approach? And I know you've really only just got these changes through, but how do you think that is going, and what's your task that you're giving Gabrielle Traynor and her organisation?
Well, the first thing I'd say is just remembering, why was Infrastructure Australia set up in the first place? It's not the state's advisor. They've all now got IA bodies that are doing that advice in the states. It's not local council's advisor. It's not, to some extent, industry's advisor either. The main client of Infrastructure Australia is myself as Land Transport Infrastructure Minister, Chris Bowen as Infrastructure Minister for Transmission and Energy Projects, Michelle Rowland on Communications Infrastructure, and Tanya Plibersek on Water Infrastructure. That is the job and role. We are their main clients. And getting Infrastructure Australia to recognise that that's who they're providing advice to. And I think what happened, as I've said previously, after a decade of basically people not really wanting their advice, just wanting to be able to invest wherever they could, and the way in which they could, Infrastructure Australia went looking for clients elsewhere. Basically, that's what it felt like to me. And so what we're trying to do is now saying, well, we're their main clients and providing that advice. Now, it might surprise people in this room, but this is the first budget process where I have got, on a project-by-project basis, particularly for those large projects over $250 million, where I've now got proper advice from my department and Infrastructure Australia on projects that are requiring Commonwealth investment. Prior to that, we had very little advice coming to government about how do you weigh up the investments being asked for from state and territory governments. What it's also meant is that I'm really relying on the assessment that Infrastructure Australia does do of the business cases and putting some discipline back into states having those. Being able to then say, well, look, we'll release or we'll put planning money aside now to actually start planning this project, and then we'll follow with construction money later. So that's really the way in which it's working now. It's not going to be turned around in a term. It's going to take quite a bit of time to get to that process, but that has well and truly started, certainly in this budget process.
I have to say this Inland Rail and rail in general is a gift that keeps on giving in the Slido here. So I'm really going to try to bottom out the questions about rail. So this, I think, is a really interesting one. You talked in your address about equity, and the importance of making sure that it's not just our 5 fringe cities that are doing well out of infrastructure projects and so forth. That's about social licence also to a degree. What have you learned about the importance of social licence from Inland Rail? I think you are really, at the end of the day, as a government, the owner of that piece of it. And so how's that going to impact the future of this project and what you're thinking about for other infrastructure projects?
Well, I think it's about, look, the nature and scale of large-scale infrastructure projects is that not everyone is going to be happy. And I think if you start from a point that you want every single person where this project is going to be happy, then we're never going to build anything. That's the reality of it. So, but what you do is make sure when you are scoping projects, that you actually embed yourself in local communities. You listen to, what is important to them from landscape values, from land usage points of view. How do we actually make sure that we're not just sort of flying in and out and, saying this is what's going to happen in your community and, we're just going to plough through with our planning permit. How are we actually going to make sure that we've listened to you as best we possibly can? And I think sometimes that does mean we have to take a bit of time. Inland Rail, I think particularly, the biggest lesson, or the 2 big lessons I think from the SHOT review, is that, was ARTC the right body to deliver? Basically, what was the biggest infrastructure project crossing 3 states, multiple local government areas, really difficult topography. Was it the best body to actually do that work? It hadn't done it before, been really good at maintaining our rail freight network and, the use of the rail freight network, but was it the best body? So making sure we've got those governance structures right and the right people in place, and that's why, I'm going to get criticised that how slow high-speed rail is, but there's a reason that I'm taking the time to get the people in place, get those structures right, get the business case right, and actually work through those issues because of the lessons of Inland Rail.
Thank you. And one last question about railways, and this is going to be the last one. And I think it's the horse of self-interest, because I'm sure there are quite a few people in this room, not the least of which Melinda Salento, our CEO, have come from Melbourne and had to get to the airport this morning to get here. How many in the room came through Melbourne Airport at some point to get here? Yes, quite a few. Yes, there we go, quite a few. Not me. I come from Perth, at the end of a rail line that occasionally floods and then gives us all a great deal of concern. But Melbourne Airport Rail. So you've got an umpire now, Neil Scales, between the state and the airport owner, APAM. Anything that you've got as a particular objective there? Anything you want to say about Melbourne Airport Rail?
Well, I think it's an important project for the state of Victoria, and I think the Victorian government does as well. It's why we've both kept our investments on the table, but we want to be able to deliver it. And I think the challenge we've obviously got is making the decision about where the station box goes and that dispute we have with the airport. Trying to get that settled, I don't think it's helpful for us to play that out in the public domain. I know there's a lot of interest in it, but I've asked Neil to do the work and provide advice to the three of us, really as partners in this project, as to how best we can proceed with it. And we'll take that advice on board as we go through this project. At the moment, where it's important, we think it's something that we've got to do, but we're just not there yet, and that's the reality of the project right at the moment.
Yeah, and I'll give you some lived experience from Western Australia, and I'm sure you know exactly what I'm going to say about the rail link there. Because all of us who have ever gone through that airport, and there's Liz Ritchie giving us a bit of a laugh, I think it's 900 metres from the terminal. And the walk from that 900 metres would require you to go through two humongous roundabouts. There's really no way that's going to happen. And so it's a real tragedy that the opportunity to connect appropriately from one side of the terminal, it's much better on the other side of the terminal, but the way the runway operates. So I just give that as a real prompt to say, even if it's someone else's job, someone else's problem to solve, please make sure they solve it properly and don't solve it in the way they've done it in WA.
Well, thanks for that. I mean, interesting, obviously, with my other hat on as the regulator of airports as well. I'm both the planning minister and the regulator of airports. It's a very interesting sort of dichotomy there. But is the disability access or mobility access of airports has actually been a really significant focus of the aviation white paper. And trying to it's been really interesting to see airports start to think about these issues much more proactively than they have before. So obviously transport links to the airport and the responsibilities airports and airlines have are also part of the thinking that I bring to the table on both that project but also on my capacity as Planning Minister for our airports.
Yeah, look, I'm very pleased to hear that. As an older Australian who is only going to get older, there is no pathway in the opposite direction, unfortunately. You know, as we make things more accessible, it also will help older Australians, and we're seeing, you know, our demographic changing a great deal towards that. Now, we're going to pivot because the top question has now got to the point of green. I knew we were going to have to get there very quickly. So you've spoken a lot about making sure that infrastructure investment supports sustainability. You said it again this morning. And so what's the real opportunity that government can have to incentivise contractors to actually get into green construction?
So there's a few pieces of work happening. So infrastructure and transport ministers have charged Infrastructure Australia with actually looking at the issue of net zero and infrastructure, and there's a really significant piece of work that IA has done for us as well. I am in the process, which I'm sure all of you will enjoy, of negotiating the next National Partnership Agreement. They're now called Federation Financing Agreements, so FFAs, with every state and territory, which is the agreement by which the Commonwealth then enacts investment in infrastructure. And part of that has been increasing the sorts of things that we are asking for in return for our investment. And so they do include things like how do we build in the circular economy into infrastructure investments. As you'd know, other than for Inland Rail, High Speed Rail, Western Sydney Airport, Moorebank, and a couple of other projects, we don't do the direct procurement. States do all of that direct procurement and direct tendering, and so the FFA is actually a really important mechanism that we'll be requiring the states to begin to look at these issues. There's great examples of that around the country, but we want to see more of those. And again, that links back in to the Future Made in Australia speech that the Prime Minister made yesterday, and you'll hear a lot more about that in the upcoming budget. So projects like Victor Harbour, I think, for example, are using recycled glass from McLaren. Now, we're not always able to have those sorts of materials available locally or close, but you're starting to see a bit of that. That also does, of course, bring challenges to cost, but that requirement being within the FFA means that tenders shouldn't just be considering, what is the cheapest price. They've actually got to also consider how is this project contributing to the procurement standards of the Commonwealth, how is it contributing to the circular economy, how is it looking at embodied carbon, and how is it actually ensuring that we are employing more apprentices and traineeships as part of the Commonwealth's program. So you'll start to see a lot more of that. States at the moment are only required to report back to me when I sign off on whether we're releasing money on First Nations targets of employment. There'll be a lot more requirements on them under the new FFA going forward, if they sign it, of course.
Yeah, thank you, Minister. The glass example is an interesting one, and I must say recently I was delighted to see that tyre recycling is starting to be a thing, in Australia, because when you think of the tyres, particularly like up in the Pilbara and in Queensland in the resource areas on the huge bit of kit that runs around there, it's crazy to imagine that we're not thinking about how to recycle those tyres. In the United States, a lot of the roofs are made out of asphalt shingle. I'm not sure there's much of that in this nation. We probably don't even know how to make an asphalt shingle, but it's a very interesting roofing material. But Liz Ritchie has asked me particularly if you would comment on how your infrastructure policy statement is intersecting with the regional investment framework, particularly how do we get regions to the front line of energy transition?
And the first thing I'd say is many of the infrastructure projects that we invest in, particularly now that we've actually moved to, so there's this corridor funding, so actually thinking about how do we fund a corridor of projects rather than just one project in a corridor, and so providing the states opportunities to actually schedule those projects along the corridor. And trying to encourage them to also think about what else do you do while you're building that corridor? Is it an opportunity while you're looking at that corridor to also look at investing in mobile telecommunications infrastructure? Is this corridor going through a major tourism area? Is it actually also requiring further upgrades in terms of rest stops? So trying to look at the whole of the corridor rather than just it is just a piece of infrastructure and a particular project. So that's we're really only at the start of that, but that corridor investment allows states to move money between infrastructure projects, and I think that will be important. In terms of the energy transition, again, there are huge opportunities in the region. With my transport hat on, obviously, we are going to need significant investment in sustainable aviation fuels and in biodiesel in this country, and being able to produce that and getting that into market and into refineries to be able to use, and land transport is going to be a significant part of that story. We're obviously in a really significant energy transmission at the moment, and I've got projects in my own constituency that are really challenging, as we know that instead of us generating all of our energy from coal-fired power stations that have been in one part of the country and then the transmission coming into our cities and around, we are now able to generate, because of the huge nature of this country, energy in lots of different places, and moving that around is challenging. So I think making sure that regional communities are beneficiaries of that, and I mean not just from the jobs in construction, but also that they get access to good, clean, cheaper energy themselves in their communities, that we're not just seen to be producing it for somewhere else. Also making sure that there is good and reasonable remuneration and compensation for people who are hosting transmission lines or are hosting particular projects is important. We learnt that from wind farms and from over 20 years of wind farm development, but also making sure, again, when we're planning and developing these projects, that we understand the importance of landscapes to communities and try and do the best we possibly can to ensure that land use planning is incorporated in. And that means engaging really early, and whilst that's hard to do, but engaging really early with local councils who actually know their communities pretty well, and really, to some extent, when I say with transmission projects, like actually walking the line and understanding why is this important, why will people care about this particular area, and thinking about it, using existing easements where you can. So they're the lessons that I would suggest we need to learn.
We just have a few minutes left, only two actually. I'm going to sneak in one last question.
Of course.
How do you take into account housing needs in prioritising infrastructure? You knew it had to come with the migration thing, and you talked last year about migration needing to do more of the heavy lifting, to get the skills into Australia while we're training our own people. But housing is the big elephant right in the corner of the room.
Yep. So again, there's a few things happening in this space, like a lot happening in this space. The government's investing over $24 billion in 17 different housing programs. It's a huge investment in really trying to break that cycle of getting more supply into the marketplace. One small element that I have within my portfolio of that is the housing support program. It was not surprising to me, but I was surprised at the level of it. When I spoke, for example, with the Lord Mayor of Melbourne, Sally Capp, she said that she had planning approvals already for around 22,000 dwellings in the city of Melbourne that were basically not progressing because I guess the environment had changed for that investment about what return you were going to get. So people were waiting for better market conditions or really banking those planning approvals until the capital was available and you were going to get that return on investment. So the housing support program, it's a $500 million program. It's just opened in the last couple of weeks, where it's doing two things. One is it's investing in local government and states for increased planning capacity so that we can release land. But also the second part of that is actually sort of taking some of the funding risk out for developers and for local councils. So the fund will be available for things like the connecting utilities, sewerage, water to new housing estates. It's part of our 1.2 million homes that we absolutely have to build, and they all need to be built around well located, so around public transport links, around active transport links, really making sure that they're part of that. So that program is open and available now for local government and for state governments to apply for it. And I'd encourage, if there are developers in the room, to talk to the local councils where your developments are. If you're able to bring those developments to market more quickly or would like to, then really that housing support program is trying to de-risk some of those costs and particularly in terms of infrastructure investment.
Well, Minister, I think what remains is for me to thank you and to point out that actually I can't see the screen there that tells me how much time I've got left. So I don't know if I'm cutting us off short, but according to my run sheet, we're supposed to finish now and invite Gabrielle Traynor, the Chair of Infrastructure Australia, to come up with a session on infrastructure outlook, pathways and strategic decisions. We have got a lot of questions. Yeah, look at all these questions that we didn't get to. And so apologies to those of you in the room and online whose questions I didn't get to. But what this does allow CEDA to do is to understand what was on your mind and it does help inform our agenda going forward. And I'm sure we've got a way of getting it to your office, so you'll be able to see what it was that you didn't get to talk to. But thank you again.
Terrific. Thank you so much for having me today.